Hi, I'm Jonathan Mamrell, and here we're on another HR Engage podcast episode. And I'm joined today by Matt McFarlane. Matt, how you going, mate?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Matt, so I'm really excited to have you on the HR Engage podcast because we're going to hear some really interesting things today. Probably a little bit different from just a straight out HR side. You've obviously got that background and everything else, but you've gone in a totally different direction. But before we get into that, I want you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, it's. I think first and foremost is that it's a bit of role reversal for me. I actually run my own podcast, so it's strange being in the hot seat myself this time around, but that's okay. A little bit about me. So, gosh, my born in Queensland, raised in Victoria, in a small rural town, lived on a farm, which was an exciting experience. In hindsight, I didn't love it as a child. Did a degree in psychology at university, and then have sort of had my entire professional career. I've lived in Brisbane, working for small, large, mid-sized companies that were, local, global, all sorts of things, but very much with a people ops sort of bend to it. So I've kind of been up and down the East Coast a bit, and I've since recently moved to Pottsville in New South Wales. So I'm living that small coastal beachside life at the moment with my daily walks on the beach, which has been incredible. But that's kind of me in a nutshell.
So from the farm to the beach, you've made that change. You've obviously made also quite a few changes in your career. But you have said that you are not officially a Blue. You're still staying Maroons. That's a good thing.
Still a Maroon supporter, yeah. You can't change where you're born.
And also you've got your own podcast as well. So this is obviously, as you said, is a role reversal. What's your podcast again?
Yeah, I have a podcast called The Foundation Series, which is very creatively named after my business, which is called Foundation. And it's very much around exploring the concept of, total rewards, remuneration, compensation within organizations. So it's really about creating discussion and just hearing from others, much like this, but just hearing from others around how they're tackling the myriad, numerous challenges that come up when it comes to compensation. So it feels like it's an often under-discussed topic. And the podcast is just trying to change that. So I get to spotlight some of the cool and interesting things that companies and founders and heads of people and whoever might be doing within their respective organizations.
I'm really interested to hear a bit more about that because that's a really, it's a small part. Oh, sorry, not a small, it's a part of human resource or people and culture. Usually it's one part of it. So tell us a little bit about your journey into human resources, because that is essentially being your background. So could you tell us a little bit about your journey into HR and how that all occurred?
Yeah, it's been a journey, that's for sure. I guess if I reflect on how I even ended up in HR, so I mentioned I did a degree in psychology. I kind of got about halfway through it when I realized that it wasn't for me. It wasn't what I wanted to pursue. I think that the university that I went to, like most universities, they kind of really just, sort of forged the path more towards that sort of clinical psychologist, that type of a role. And it just wasn't for me. And so I think I was looking for other options, what else can you do with a psych degree? And I actually can't remember to this day who made the suggestion, but somebody in business had said, a lot of people with psychology degrees do go into HR. There's obviously the org psych component of it. And that was a unit of my degree. I found that interesting. I think I found the intersection of people and behaviors and just how irrational they can be, and the intersection of that with the kind of commercial side of the business, the needs and how that can be harnessed. I just found that really fascinating. And so to be honest, I didn't have any other kind of directions or thoughts about what I wanted to do. So it was kind of just let's give this a go and see what happened. But it certainly wasn't as easy as just kind of taking on a role. So I finished my degree. I moved to Brisbane literally at the end of it. I got here and I was like, okay, well, I want a HR job. What sort of a job am I looking for? There were sort of HR assistant, HR coordinator was that sort of entry level into the field. And I was just getting knocked back left, right and center. Didn't have a HR degree, didn't have any kind of, corporate experience or anything like that. And there was actually a recruiter that I spoke to, and it was an agency recruiter. And this was still a really memorable thing for me, is that they'd said, look, just get yourself into an office, do something even as basic as, go and just be an administrator for a year or something. go and just get experience working in that kind of an environment, because there is a lot of adjacencies to HR at that sort of early level. And then I think you'll find that it will be a much easier transition. And that couldn't have been more true. I jumped into an admin assistant role for a year. Literally, it was 1 year to the day. I hated it. I hated the company I was working at, but I was there for 1 year to the day, and I applied for a HR assistant role, and that was kind of my intro to HR. And I've honestly just never looked back. Yeah, I love it. It was the diversity of the field is huge, which is hilarious because I actually hated that about psychology, but I like it about HR. Yeah, I think that the diversity that is kind of imposed on people, professionals, is huge. And I've since taken the step to focus on just one very small part of that with the compensation field. But yeah, I loved it. I loved the variety. I loved how much of a engine room of the business, I think I felt like HR was. Like, it's so critical. You don't have anything. Even the most product heavy companies in the world don't have anything if it's not for their people. And I think I just always loved how there were all these different levers we could pull to try and make that more successful and more effective. And yeah, that was kind of me. So got into that HR assistant job, and I think I kind of never looked back. I think for me it was how could I keep up experiencing every different aspect of HR and the people space. So yeah, had a real generalist job, I would say, to start with, and then ended up moving into one where the focus was more on industrial relations. I was really keen to get some more experience there. I felt like because I didn't have the degree, and I wasn't really getting a huge sort of exposure to the IR side of things, I really wanted to kind of add that to my toolkit. So I joined a heavily unionized food manufacturing environment, which was super challenging. Some incredible people, an amazing environment, and I think I got that IR experience in spades. I think I ended up being a part of, or in some cases leading, negotiations with for enterprise agreements. I think we ended up doing something like 6 or 7 in a year. It was huge. And so yeah, got that in spades. Really enjoyed that. I felt like I got to really step into a place where I felt like I had a lot more autonomy. I felt like I had a lot more of an ability to take on more responsibility, which is very much what I was looking for. And then where did I go next? Oh gosh, I think that these would be some of the lessons I no doubt reflect on. And in later parts of this conversation, I moved into the legal industry. Didn't love that. I didn't spend a lot of time there. No offense.
None taken.
Yeah, it was in a law firm, and I think just got sold one thing and it wasn't the other. And unfortunately, that was a common, that happened multiple times in my career, which I can expand on later. But just found myself in an environment that just wasn't for me, which, sometimes you don't know until you get there, as much as you try to sort of vet for that in the interview process. But I was young, keen to just take that next opportunity. So yeah, I was there for a few months, ended up leaving. And then this was sort of I'd say my second experience jumping into a tech space. The first was in the admin assistant job, but yeah, jumped into a tech startup, and that was again just such a huge awakening for me because I think it was my first truly global position. So and I think the other really kind of memorable aspect of it was that it, again, highly autonomous environment, but also a growing environment. So we were growing the team in Brisbane that I was a part of. We were growing the company. It had just recently been majority acquired by an even larger tech company, but still had a fair bit of separation. And I think just that environment was so everything I look for. It was greenfields in many respects. So I had the ability to kind of build something from scratch, which I loved. I really got to kind of lead on a bunch of things that I think were not only really important to me and things that I just wanted to experience and kind of tick off from a career perspective, but were also things that the business needed as well. So that was that was an amazing experience. Had another little mistake job there in the middle, and then moved into we've all had them.
A few of these in this career.
Mate, I tell you what, I've got some lessons, that's for sure. So yeah, had one of those, and then moved into another manufacturing environment. Again, enjoyed that, but fundamentally got lured away by another opportunity to join a tech company, which is again just another real capstone experience for me. So this, in particular, I got to join them at a stage where I don't know, remote work had just kind of really started to accelerate with COVID, and the business themselves very much sold into that space. We were scaling massively. So, I mean, when I got there, we were 250. We scaled to 650 people across 70 countries. So, when you're leading the people ops space for a company like that, the complexity is enormous. but we just had some of the most incredible team members, just some of the smartest people I've ever worked with. And we just, we just delivered. We shipped great, HR products, and we shipped great solutions and services and things like that. And it was just a time I reflect on very, very, very positively. But I think one of the things that's kind of been a thread or a constant throughout my career is that I've always kind of had that real comp ownership, no matter where I've been in those roles and probably some of the others that I haven't covered. Just have always found it a really fascinating space. And the last role that I was in particular, I got a really great platform to speak about the experience of running a people ops function for the business I was in. Again, scaled by hundreds in many different countries. And I think one of the things that a lot of people in my network often broached as a topic with me was, how do we tackle compensation? A lot of people felt like it was, it's a very challenging topic. Where do we go? How do we get this right? It's obviously very deeply emotive for the individual at the companies. And so they're just looking for some direction on how to get it right for one country, let alone, dozens. So, so I kind of got to a point where, I felt like I was ready to move on from this organization, like many tech companies in that sort of 2022, 23 era, big downturn. Didn't feel like I, had the space to grow professionally as I really wanted. And as you can probably tell is a real theme of my career. Like I very much have been focused on diversity, variability. How can I be uncomfortable to and experience something new and grow myself as a professional? That's been a real theme of mine. Didn't feel like I was getting that anymore. Had always kind of had this real interest in working for myself, doing my own thing, and what that might look like. And I think I felt like I was at a point where I felt ready for that. I felt like I was ready to dive in. I felt like I had established a good network in terms of, trying to do business development, which is something I'd never had to do before. And I just felt like I really identified this need. So, I had great experience with compensation. I felt like I'd done a pretty good job of it in terms of the places that I've worked and the things that I delivered. It was very clear that the people that I engaged with in my network didn't feel confident with it, and it felt like there was a lot of need for it. But I think as well, the environment when it comes to compensation, remuneration, especially at a global level, is just changing dramatically. So three key things really come to mind for me, and which were part of the catalyst for me wanting to make this leap. So one is that pay transparency is growing enormously. And I mean, even just in Australia, we're seeing big steps taken with WGEA and some of the expectations that are being imposed on organizations there. We're not at, full pay transparency just yet, but we're on the path, I would say.
Yes.
But you look at the US, you look at Canada, you look at other countries, Europe in particular, bringing in some huge pieces of legislation around pay transparency. And that's putting a lot of pressure on companies to catch up because they're not there. The other two things that are sort of happening, one is that, whilst pay transparency is really happening at a sort of legislative level, is that, you're speaking to or seeing this sort of incumbent workforce become really is starting to become a real dominant workforce, which is the emergence of the Gen Z employee, and they have very different expectations around pay. There is no taboo. They do not have a concern about asking you what you're earning or telling you what they're earning. They don't have a problem with it at all. But even more so is that they're very, very comfortable asking companies why they're being paid what they're paid and expecting them to justify it. And so that's another thing that's, putting pressure on businesses to go, oh, actually, why are we paying what we pay? And how do we articulate that to people? Because this new workforce that we're expecting to hire is looking for this answer. And then third and finally is just that the technology in this space has evolved rapidly to the point now where, you've gone from an environment where we all used to buy, and we still do in some cases, we buy these surveys that capture data from 6 or 12 months ago for what people are paying. We're now at a stage where there's, live benchmarking is a thing. You're seeing people's HRIS data be anonymized, but, ultimately made available to people in a live fashion. So you can see how the market is moving day by day, if you like. And that, in addition to just the ability to handle compensation and your compensation practices, has been hugely enabled by technology to the point where now even small organizations can be super buttoned up and really competitive in that space. And again, this, is just another thing. This is adding pressure to companies to get compensation right. And so I kind of left this company going, people keep asking me about pay. I've done a lot of stuff to do with pay. The environment around pay is changing dramatically. So, I don't know what a gap in the market's supposed to look like, but this this might be one of them.
This could be it.
The trifecta, the golden trifecta. And so, kind of without anything else to go on, I was just like, well, why not give this a go? I've always wanted to work for myself. Let's give this a crack. And so, ever since late 2023, I've been a consultant, a solopreneur running my own organization, which is Foundation, and very much, this is about as niched as it gets. So not just within HR and not just within compensation, but like startup compensation. So really companies that are like 50 to 500 people, they're wanting help to establish some of these fundamentals. Hence why I called my company Foundation. And just helping them get a lot of these things in place, helping them be able to work out, when they're hiring people, what's reasonable, what's the salary expectations? If we're going to do workforce planning, how do we forecast the costs for growing a company? How do we run a compensation cycle and know that we're being fair and consistent and practical in our approach? So that's kind of where I've been for the past sort of 14, 15 months and loving every day of it. So that was a really long, rundown of the journey, but
it's a long journey. I mean, this journey has been for you, and there's been a few missteps, as you said as well, that the HR background, I mean, actually psychology, office admin background, and then turning that into a HR role. I want to pick up a few things that you've said there, because there's quite a few things, and I'd love to dig into quite a number of them. But maybe the first thing I'd like to ask you about is that gap between you were that office administration position, essentially trying to get your foot in the door, which you said was quite good advice. What was that gap like from the office administration role then to take on your sort of first like HR advisor role? What was that like? And were they different industries? I think there were different industries as well. Like, what was that like, that gap?
Yeah, so I moved from, an admin in the software industry into a HR assistant or HR coordinator it was professional services, but with a focus on the defense industry, which is interesting. And the gap wasn't, again, like I think at that time, and I don't even hazard to guess what year this was. I'd have to go back and remind myself, but a long time ago.
Let's not say any years.
Yeah, we don't need to give that away. So, it was at a time when that admin function was a really core component of what HR was responsible for. I think we had a HR system that admin was just a part of the responsibility. And so I wouldn't say the leap was a massive. I think in actual fact, it was good because it gave me a space to sort of really lean into my first ambitions around like automation and being able to really kind of take a systems thinking approach to some of the things we were doing in the admin space. So I think if anything, I felt like I didn't have that space to grow in the role that I was in, hence why I left. And I remember building stuff, and this was just in like SharePoint. I just remember building like an onboarding system and a checklist to make sure that we had consistency, that, not only were we being compliant in terms of the expectations that we had both from pre-onboarding, but during onboarding and things like that. But it just helped automate things. It would, send messages. And, this was back in the day where you would pay good money for systems that did this. But I remember that's a memory that sticks with me as being something that was really cool that I got to experiment with in that sort of formative step. But I don't think it was like, I don't think there were any skill sets that I was missing. No, actually, I lie because I fundamentally ended up going into an industrial relations type of role. But it's that would be the main thing, I think, is just that grounding in the IR side of things and the understanding. That was really where I got my first exposure to what the Fair Work Act even was, and the NES and all those sorts of things. So I would say that was probably the biggest gap. But the actual skill set around how to do the administration from a HR perspective, I didn't feel like that was much of a gap.
So this, looking at from a skills perspective, the skill gap was more when you transition from more of a generalist type HR role to a bit more of a focus on IR. As you said, you had 6 EBAs or enterprise agreements in 1 year in the manufacturing space. That was a bit more of a hard hitting for you. Can you explain to us, and because I think there's quite a few people who are listening to this or watching this who actually are in very union heavy or industrial relation heavy areas. And one of the things that they talk to me about is being almost like on a bit of a rat race. You sort of, spinning your wheels quite a lot. There's quite a lot happening and you get stuck in the weeds maybe doing a lot of firefighting. Is that also what you found, or do you find your experience a little bit different?
No, that about sums up my experience as well, I would say. Yeah, I think that was, look, did I get the experience that I wanted? Yes. Did I love it? No, like it definitely wasn't a path that I ended up wanting to pursue, but I also want to acknowledge that it was, fundamental to enabling me in some other parts of my career. And I just don't think you can do a generalist job without having some of that as a cornerstone. So it was an important step. Did I want to have did I want the percentage of my role to be as high on the IR side of things as it was in that position? No, not long term, but it just ended up being a necessity for every other job I was in, even global jobs, because you had Australian employees and you got to know what's going on. You got to know how to handle certain things. And so it was really critical for those things. But no, I think the experience that you're sharing there is very much it was one of the big drivers for me fundamentally taking the next job. Was it did feel like it was very much a reactive firefighting type of role where you're responding to things rather than necessarily putting things in place that are kind of forward looking or something like that.
I wanted to pick up on that global part, because I think if we zoom out, that was probably one of your biggest areas of expertise, and which has sort of led you down this path of compensation. Mm-hmm. But I want to zoom out a little bit. You took on some global roles, or truly global roles. You had, I think it was technology companies where you had staff pretty much everywhere and anywhere. Yeah. You talked about the complexities with that. Now, I think a lot of us know from the Australian experience, like there are complexities, a lot to do with, the laws also have a part to play, but also there is definitely, remote work and work from home and all these different kettle of fish to deal with. What are the complexities like internationally from your experience? And is there anything you'd like to share with us on that front?
Yeah, it's funny because you start to realize how much of a spectrum there is in terms of that complexity side of things. I mean, you go from the US would be one of the least complex, I would say, just in terms of like, when you think of like worker protections, there isn't a lot there, and even fundamentally, they're not entitled to a paid day off for a public holiday, right? Like it's common practice to do it, but they're not getting an Anzac Day or an Easter long weekend like we've just had. They're not getting that by default. They're getting it because their companies have chosen to do it as a practice. So you kind of go from that end of the spectrum where, there are still some requirements and expectations, but I would say it's more on the like health insurance, okay, which is their superannuation equivalent. It's more on the management of those things, I would say, when it comes to, that sort of
is that the management from a communication perspective? Was that management from talking to the actual companies that are providing that service?
Both. I mean, how it's administered. Honestly, the most complex thing I would say from managing a US workforce is the health benefits. It's the health insurance, and just understanding like it's a beast. And so your understanding of how that works, even to be honest, like even a lot of employees don't understand what they're getting or what they've got. They've got co-payments, they've got this, they've got that, they've got like, it's just such a different environment. But there is a lot of, rules and requirement around how it works that you've kind of got to be familiar with.
And in terms of, so I think you did a lot of work with Europe as well. And did you do some work with Asia as well? Is that?
A bit of all of that.
Yeah. And in terms of the complexities there, considering you're based, you're based here, I assume you were based here most of the time. What were the complexities you dealt with from those perspectives?
Anything and everything. Some of the stuff that comes to mind is, I think it's Brazil that has like a 13th month salary. And Italy, I think has 13th and 14th. So, there's all these things like that. Some places have these, mandatory allowances. Like, I think it's Portugal, it's very common, or it's a requirement to pay. It's like I'm trying to think of what it is. It's like a benefits allowance, but it can be put towards like purchasing food and things like that. I'm scratching the depths of my memory here, but it's very different. Every country is unique. I think a core requirement of operating in those sorts of environments was, of course, the legal counsel that we had, who were very good at helping us map those things out. And then I guess we were very much the kind of human experience overlay on that. How can we make sure that it's an effective process? How are we systematizing it? How are we ensuring that, we're not only meeting our compliance obligations, but we're factoring in the things that we want to exceed on when it comes to benefits. How does that tie up with our people strategy? All those sorts of things. So yeah, it was honestly, it's a real mixed bag, as you can imagine. Every country is very different. There are a fair few that are quite similar. I would say Australia is probably up there with one of the more complex environments. But yeah, every country's got something different and new. And that's actually something that I love, right, about the experience, is that no 2 days were different. If you're dealing with an issue in one country, you're learning something new, like a 13th month salary, or you're learning about this new allowance that you've got to, do. And it's I find it in particular, learning the kind of cultural underpinnings about why some of those things exist as well is fascinating. But yeah, it's just, that variety was deeply attractive to me in those experiences.
I didn't even think about that complexity that you talk about just there. But so I assumed, and probably coming from my lens, that obviously had the legal side and having to get advice from local legal counsel or that sort of feeding into an in-house counsel, whatever that will work. But also there's obviously that cultural side, which potentially the unwritten rules or the way we do things, which you wouldn't have actually a clue, but you somehow have to navigate that in terms of your people. From your perspective, and of course there are those very different answers to this, I'm sure, for different countries. Dealing with these different countries, with one company, different countries, different workforces, with just all these different cultures, was that a hard thing to navigate from your perspective? I assume it was very uncomfortable. We talk about getting into that uncomfortable process, but from your perspective, what did you have to do? Was it more like reading? Was it research? Was it just talking to people? Like, how did you get across that? Or was it a mix of things?
Yeah, definitely a mix. There's one example that comes to mind, or one experience that comes to mind, that really highlighted how challenging this can be, and it was that at one of those employers, we were doing a round of redundancies, as happens, and it was a global one. We were making people in tens of countries and dozens of countries redundant at the same time, and that's probably up there with one of the more complex things I've ever been a part of, just in terms of not only do you have local obligations, but you have the cultural expectations, and then you have the company and what it's trying to achieve, and its kind of principles around how it sees that. And I think, at the time I would say we probably took a very like Western Anglo lens to how we did the layoffs, but it was very generous. But even things like, when you do a round of redundancies, and I think, here in Australia, we're fundamentally used to it being because you no longer have need for that role for whatever reasons, downturn of business, etc. That similar cultural lens doesn't apply in every country. And so, you get questions around, well, hang on, why don't we use this as a process? Why aren't we getting rid of all our poor performers? Why aren't we targeting performances for redundancies and things like that? And so trying to be consistent and cohesive and, one rule for all in some respects across that many different countries is incredibly challenging, not only in terms of execution, but in terms of messaging, and how you actually run something like that. That was one of the most interesting kind of eye-opening experiences for me, in terms of that global context. And we did basically a 24-hour shift, right? Like, we had people in my team and in other teams who were waking up, they were participating in their role in the layoff. So whether you were running a call or something like that, but we had a 24-hour cycle so that we could cover all corners of the globe. Trying to give people a heads up that this change was happening, consult with them where we needed to, have the conversation, give them the consultation period. Again, some of these concepts are very foreign for a lot of countries. So it's taking an approach that we thought was right and aligned with our values, more often than not. And I think, in fact, in every case, that exceeded the requirements of the country that we were laying somebody off in. But we were doing things that were totally unusual for that space. I mean, let's talk about the US again. They've got at-will employment in most places. You can say to someone, pack your things up today. And, we've all seen the movies where people leave with their archive boxes. That's a reality of their employment. But, we would, in this example, we were doing 3-month payouts. That's just not common for them. Usually it's a 2-week thing. Maybe you get a few weeks for each year of service. So that greatly exceeded, and it was obviously welcomed by them. But that's just one example of how what we were doing in practice was very different to the cultural norms of the space we were operating.
So in some respects, having the Australian system as your background actually really helps globally, because
Yeah.
I mean, we do have a system which is probably got a higher standard, high legal liability. There are new IR laws getting pushed out every day, and we'll see even potentially more this year and next year, which you don't see in other countries. So what I get from your saying, from a global perspective, it actually helps a lot, because it actually surpasses everything from a legal
Yeah, pretty much.
But then there's still that issue of culturally, and you say communication seems to be a key part to that.
Yeah, and in fact, that point was one I remember reflecting on, or saying to others, is that I'm really glad I've got this Australian background, because, and again, as much as I don't want IR to be my life, it's a really core, cornerstone of my experience and of helping me get through things like that. Because I remember with how much more ease I was able to understand and adjust and adapt to some of the requirements that were coming from these countries, because in many cases they already existed in Australia, or Australia exceeded them in some ways, and it could be something we may potentially be able to offer to people through that process and improve that process. But I agree 100%. I think anyone with an Australian IR background is probably well set up to be able to, at least more easily transition to a global context. I think obviously the cultural one is still a key one, but you get that, right? You pick it up through the experiences.
So it seems like the transition from a global perspective is maybe a little bit easier for someone who's got that Australian background. Your journey has had not just Australia, globally. You've then started to transition more from generalist HR. You picked up some IR as well. Then you've started to go more into compensation. And you have touched on it a little bit, but I'd love you to explain this a little bit more. Your passion around compensation and remuneration. I'm not sure if people that are listening to this, I'm sure a lot of them follow you on LinkedIn and see all your LinkedIn posts, and I'm sure in other platforms. But your passion for this area, and in particular, even going in more niche startup side, why the passion there? What sort of, was a particular moment or event that went, okay, you know what, this is where I need to be?
Yeah, I think for me, the reason compensation is so appealing, and it's kind of the same can be said of HR, I think, but for me, especially with compensation, it's obviously very analytical. I spend a lot of time in spreadsheets, which I used to hate, but I've come to love.
Okay.
But it's also a very commercial side of HR. And I think for me, that's something, especially at the earlier stages of my career, I always, I think we all as people practitioners, we come up against this kind of sit at the table thing, are we really commercial? Are we strategic? Are we this? Are we that? And I've always wanted to be the most commercial I could be for the company. Can I actually make sure that the thing we're doing is right for the business? It's going to help us fundamentally make more money or be more successful. And I think nothing could be more true of what is often the biggest cost of a business than what you're spending on salaries or what you're spending on benefits. So, it has that real analytical commercial lens, which satisfies me both from the perspective of I like analytical kinds of work. I like logic. I like reasoning. I like those sorts of things. But I like the importance of this sort of prestige isn't the right word, but I've never been turned away from a conversation that I wanted to have around compensation, because if you're speaking to the CEO or the founder or an executive, like, it's the biggest thing that one of the biggest things that's most important to them, right? Like, anytime you ever speak to an executive and you're like, it's comp review time, they're going to come and listen to you because they want to reward their people. They want to make sure they're doing the right thing, etc. So I like that, but I also love that it's also a deeply, deeply human thing, right? Like, it is so important to everybody. It means different things to every individual. It's a very emotional topic. And I think that's often the part of it that's forgotten about when you're sort of knee deep in a spreadsheet, is that you're fundamentally trying to incentivize or reward or, recognize or whatever it might be. You're trying to do that for the individual. And I think there's so much to be said for, the ways in which you can do that effectively. And I think I've been incredibly fortunate in my experience working in-house in roles to have seen that done really well. But unfortunately, I think the norm in my experience and the experience of many people I speak to is that it's not done well. And so I just think there's the benchmark can go so much higher, especially on that human element. And so that, yeah, so, it's this huge kind of spectrum that it covers as a field within compensation that is just, it's really appealing to me. And I love it. I think there's I obviously have some strong virtues for anyone who follows me on LinkedIn. I have some really strong thoughts and opinions around how comp should work. And I think it's something that can be done to a point where it achieves this real harmony between the business and its needs and its wants and the employee and its needs. Like it's not this zero-sum game. I think it really can be delivered to a point where it kind of meets everyone's, most people's needs. I'll never say everyone's because it's impossible, but it can kind of operate in that space where it's working for the company and it's working for the individual as well. But yeah, that's why I love it.
It seems from what you're saying about comp, that taboo side of things, which is probably what shrouded it for a very long time. And of course, we've had actual legislation that is now pulling some of those layers off. But it's arguable that probably even before then, that's what's led to some of these pay transparency laws. You've also said that moving past the taboo side, that actually pretty much if you want to talk to anyone about compensation, you can, because it's fundamental, it's operational, it's strategic, like there's many parts to it. If you were to sort of break that down a little bit for us, say a normal human resources generalist position, because I think a lot of people are still in that HR generalist. I'm sure there are a few specialists out there. There's a lot of specialists out there, but there's still a lot of generalists too. Do you think it's a bit of an undercarried area? Do you think that's an area that's probably not given as much weight comparative to some of the other areas?
Yeah, I think so for a number of reasons. One, and I used to be this person. One is a real fear and intimidation around the analytical side of things. So people that say I'm not a numbers person or I'm not very good at spreadsheets. I was that person and I got good at it, right? Like it's just an experience thing. It's an interest thing. It's that's what it is. I learned everything from the school of YouTube. For those who think that I've gone and done a data analytics degree, no, I've learned as I needed to. I'm not a degree kind of. I've obviously done a degree. I'm not that kind of a learner. I've learned everything that I've needed to through Google, through YouTube, and now the main sort of path for me is AI, obviously. But yeah, I think that's often a big obstacle for people is that fear of the analytical side of things. What else do I think it's also one of those things that, because it often gets thought of as just this cyclical thing, we've just got to run our annual cycle, right? And then I think once that's done, we all kind of breathe a sigh of relief, we wipe the sweat off our brow and we kind of get on with the next burning fire. And I think that's the environment that a lot of professionals are in, specialists or generalists alike. So getting the time to sit down and think and go, actually, what about this didn't work for us? What about the experience wasn't great for our people? How could we improve on it next time? I don't often think that moment is taken because we're off doing another thing that's needed to be done, and so it's not being done. But I also, in many cases, I also think people don't. It's hard to know what good looks like in the world of compensation, and hence why I mentioned I run a podcast, right? Like I think there's so many incredible examples that are out there, and we just need to lift the lid on it and expose people to what they can do and how diverse it can be and how it can work for the business. But for a long time in my career, it was just this is what you do, and everyone I spoke to was the same. You kind of ask around what's the average increase people are giving to their employees that might, in some way get put into the budget. Then you've got to dice that up and give it to managers. You got to create a spreadsheet. You got to get them to give it to their people. You got to make sure that they're not giving one person too much and another person too little. This whole thing of like comp ratios and range penetration and comp philosophies, like this was all totally foreign to me for a long part of my career because I just thought this is what compensation is. You just got to get through the process. It's so much more to it. And I think, we're slowly seeing the evolution of it into something that's really seen as a strategic lever to the business. And I think we're seeing a lot more, ownership and involvement in getting it done really well, but there's a long way to go.
From your perspective, compensation, do you think it will stay or move into finance or HR, or will it stay in both camps? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because obviously different companies run it differently in different ways. But what are your personal thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally a people domain from my perspective again. And I think, it is deeply, it's an analytical one, it's a commercial one. There's always going to be a very strong, tight partnership over how this is handled, of course. But I think, if anything, I would say it needs to move more into the domain of a chief people officer. And I put up a post not long ago that was a little controversial around, who should sign off the actual pay review budget. So, if you imagine a scenario where the budget's been determined by finance, that the CFO has signed that off. And I think maybe this was part of the confusion in some respects, but if the budget's signed off and you adhere to that budget and the frameworks that are in place around how it's apportioned and how it's dished out to people, so long as that's been followed and the chief people officer or whoever's running the analysis and things like that is comfortable that we haven't, contravened any fair pay issues or anything like that. Like, I think from my perspective, fundamentally, the head of people should be signing that off. Yes, we're under budget, or if we've gone over, we've gone and sought approval, but we are comfortable that this has been applied in a manner that is consistent with our philosophy. It's applied in a manner that's consistent with our goals from a talent strategy perspective. We are that person. We should be signing it off. But the role of finance can't be understated as well. And, if we don't have strong analytical skill sets in the people team, then that is another excellent way to partner with them on this. But I think we're only seeing more and more of that analytical skill set and that analytical role become a mainstay of the people team, which is just telling me that we're even more equipped to handle some of this stuff. Going into a pay review, we're doing a pay equity analysis. Are we paying fair compared to the market? Are we paying fair compared to each other? What's our gender pay gap? Where do we need to improve things? And then doing it at the other side as well. Have we actually hit the goals that we had for our pay review? That's another concept that was foreign to me. What are we actually doing this for? Right? Are we just doing it to give people money, or what are the things we're trying to solve for? But we're trying to reward people. We're trying to incentivize the things we want to see. And I think for so long I didn't realize. And I think a lot of people go into comp reviews not thinking about it from that perspective. They just think we've got a number, we've got to dish it out, we've got to make sure it's fair, and then we just got to get on to the next thing. But yeah, I think, like, to answer your question, it's a people domain for me. You're dealing with a big cost, but it's for all of your people. It touches every individual.
I think there's a lot of people listening right now who are just going, I just need to take that snippet and put that in front of my board, put that in front of my other directors. For those at home, that's around 42 or 43 minutes into this podcast. He talks about that every episode, just in case you want to snip that out. If I could just change a little bit tact here, I want you to sort of maybe time travel with me here, because there's a lot of early career HR people listening to this podcast or watching this podcast. If you could go back in time to the early career Matt, what advice would you have for early career Matt?
I mean, look, one of the things I touched on at the start of this was my propensity for getting into roles that I didn't love. I think if there's anything, some of these things you don't know until you know.
Yes.
I think I wish I was better and maybe a little more diligent. And actually, I think Gen Z are getting this right, but I wish I was a little bit more diligent in, who I would go and work for. It's easy to be lured by the appeal of a company and its brand or whatever it might be. And I think there are a couple of times there where I got into a role and I was just like, God, I've made a huge mistake here. And sometimes I overstayed.
How quickly did you realize that? How quickly did you realize you go, like, that's...
Oh, so one of them was in the first 3 months, I realized, it was, how I knew one of the ways I knew there was many flags. I had messaged, I knew I was their first HR person. It was a head of people role. I was their first HR person and I had messaged them. I knew they weren't going to have onboarding. They were going to have all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I emailed the CEO a good 3 weeks before I was meant to start. And I was like, hey, I'd love to be able to hit the ground running. I need a laptop, I need a screen, I need a desk. Can someone order me these things and have them ready for when I get there? And I got there on day one, and guess what wasn't there? There was nothing there. It was, I remember it was not long after COVID, and he was like going on the Apple website thinking he could just get one same day. And it was like a 3-week wait. And I was like, what did I tell you? So yeah, I think that was just one. And I remember just going, oh my God. Anyway, that I was like, I'll give them a fair bit of latitude because this is their first people role. But yeah, there was red flag after red flag. So some of them you just don't know until you get there, I think.
And so the early career, I suppose, HR people, what would be advice for them? Just like look a bit more, be more diligent. That's just sort of you're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's only an extent to which you can do it. I mean, be clear about what the role is. I certainly went into roles not being clear, or as clear as I could be. And look, some of them it was again, something you don't know until you get in there. But if you're sold on a dream, like, just understand the plan a bit better. If the company's talking about transformation or change or things like that, like understand what that looks like and your role in it. How will they know if it's going to be successful? I think there's all these sorts of questions around, who was the last person that left and why, can I speak to a current employee? There's all these sorts of things. I think now you can just reach out on LinkedIn and say, hey, I'm considering a role. Would you like to, would you be open to having a chat, which is a great thing to do. I think just, looking beyond just the sort of surface level job ad and maybe, I think everything you see on LinkedIn these days is about, not having elongated interview processes, but honestly, you want to have 2 or 3 interviews. I think you want to have a chance to speak to more than just the hiring manager or the recruiter, because that's going to give you a bit more of a lens. And obviously ask questions at the end. Don't be that person that just goes and answers their questions. Make sure you come with a list of questions. What are your deal breakers? What are the things that are critical for you? What are the things that are nice to have? And you just got to take it on balance and hopefully ticks most of the boxes.
There's also a lot of people that are listening to this podcast that are also well into their experience. They're well into their role. They even have maybe a seat at the table. They're in senior positions potentially. What are 2 big pieces of advice you'd have for them?
Yeah, there's one strong one that comes to mind in terms of like a lesson I felt like I had to learn a couple of times, is that I think sometimes I could be really idealistic about stuff, how I thought something should happen, what I thought was fair, what I thought was reasonable. And I think you have to be that champion in many ways, because that's the role that you have. But I think you also have to be sure that it's not getting in the way of, and I don't want this to be misinterpreted as, make money at all costs, but I think you need to recognize when to, or I guess pick your battles is probably a better way of saying it, right?
Yeah.
You are an important stakeholder when it comes to the culture of the company and the culture that you're trying to uphold. But I think there were definitely circumstances in my reflection where I was probably a little too idealistic about an outcome of something. And it may have, damaged a relationship, or it may have resulted in me being seen as less of as a commercial operator fundamentally. So I think if there's one thing that I would suggest, it's just check that idealism a little bit every now and then. But it's also, the other thing is, it's a beautiful thing, right? Like, we have to be that person. But I think it's just finding the balance that's right. And the other thing, you'll come to learn is whether that threshold aligns with your own threshold, right? If you can't be at the certain sort of level of virtuistic and whatever that you want to be, then maybe it's time to move on. And then the other big learning I would say is that, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit already, is that I think our function can find ourselves getting caught up a lot in a very kind of reactive state. We're responding to a complaint, we're doing an investigation, we're doing whatever it might be. Firefighting is the common kind of term used. And I think one of the best things I ever did when I was leading people teams was create carve-outs for that and create a space to actually be able to focus on the stuff that we love, that is going to, change things and make them better for the people that, that work at our company. Because I think it's very easy, and I've certainly been caught up in it in the past, where I just spent 24, I get to the end of the day and go, I actually don't know what I've done. I've had a conversation here. I've, coached a leader there, or I've responded to an email because someone had a query. And I think if you let that inflate and take over your entire day, it can, and it will. And actually, one of the cool things I ended up doing in the last in-house role I was at is I actually split the people team. So we had a people operations team, and we actually split one into a services team and one into essentially a product team. And every 6 months they'd switch, because I'm conscious that you don't want people to be focused too much on one or the other. But 6 months, we had a roadmap of things that we wanted to build. And we kind of introduced sprints. So every 2 weeks, here's the thing we want to build, or a component of it. And how can we get that out into the business? And it just gave us the space that we needed to improve things, whilst also ensuring that the firefighting was still getting done, the queries were still being resolved, all those sorts of things. But we also just were really conscious about tracking it as well. How much time is it taking up? What are the majority of the queries that we're getting? If they're payroll queries, is there something that the project team should be building to actually resolve the query because it's popping up so often? So we just became really sort of data informed about it. And also, like, if we're getting too many complaints that the HR team isn't responsive, let's look at our capacity. Are we dealing with the same number of things, or are they bigger, or what's going on? Okay, well, if the business wants us to quieten down the people that feel like they're having a poor experience, let's talk about a case for more resource, or a case for a better system that's going to help us improve, give us time to solve this issue. So that was kind of the lens that we took, which it just really helped us get out of this kind of reactive mindset that I think a lot of us can find ourselves getting into. One of the best changes I think I've made in my career.
That's a really good tip there. I think, a lot of people listening to this are in that reactive zone, whether they're leading a team that's it, or they're actually in a team that's doing that right now. Obviously, there have been a lot of things that are happening in the workplace in the last 3, 4, 5 years that has also led to that. So there's other circumstances too, but love that idea that you sort of thought, okay, well, we've got this situation, let's split the team, but then also after 6 months, you didn't just leave them there, you swapped them back as well. I thought that was a really interesting one.
I think that, and something else I've talked about, and to be honest, I've only been an advocate of this since I've started my own business, but is time tracking. I used to go like, well, it doesn't have any place in the HR team. We're not billable. We're not that kind of environment.
Yep.
But honestly, it just came about from me going, actually, am I going to be profitable on the things that I'm working on as a consultant now? But the insights that it gave me around where I spend my time were huge. And I just think it would be such a solve for people teams, at the very least, to do it every now and then and go, okay, let's track our time for a week as a team and just go, where are we spending our time? But I think it just gives you so much insight into where you're focused. And then you just need to go, okay, is it where we want to be? Or actually, is it what this team is here to do, and then take steps from there? But I think that in hindsight, I think in the past I probably would have used that approach had I known what I know now.
So are you saying that lawyers and accountants are somehow onto something with time tracking?
Absolutely.
That's all I heard.
Yeah, you've got a learning there, a key learning that we should be embracing.
Okay, so from a HR perspective, and I suppose from a comp perspective as well, and I know they're not mutually exclusive, but in some respects they are. I understand that. But for you, what's the biggest challenge you're facing now? Obviously, you're in that consultancy space now, but what are the biggest challenges you're facing now, or maybe you're seeing HR facing now, and how are they tackling that?
I would say one of the big things that comes up with compensation, and again, I think this comes from maybe more a lack of awareness, or people like me talking about things on LinkedIn too much. But I think a lot of people can get caught up in best practice and this kind of fallacy that there's one best way to do something.
Yep.
And so often there's a bit of work I need to do when I am working with a client or engaging with someone, just around helping them understand that comp isn't one size fits all. There's not like one beautiful solution that just solves all of your needs. There's something that's right for now, and then there's something that's going to be right for tomorrow, and it's different for every company. And that can be said of any discipline of HR, I would say. But again, in my niche and my space specifically, I think a lot of people expect me to kind of be able to put in the McFarlane framework, and it's just kind of the one size fits all that works for everybody, when it's not. And it needs to really be tied to what you're trying to achieve as a company, and what are the things that are important for you, who you're trying to attract, who you're trying to retain, how do you want to do that, do you want to reward them, incentivize them, etc. But I think it can also be symptomatic of just the time shortness and that sort of reactive nature that we tend to be in, that they want a solution. It's just that often the solution needs to be configured for the business. And so there's a little bit of a, alignment of understandings, I guess, around what that looks like, versus just being able to go, cool, well, you're going to review salaries once a year. Here's the data set you're going to use. You're going to pay people at the 50th percentile and just all of these things are cookie cutter like every other company. It shouldn't be that way. So I think that can be one of the challenging things. I think as well, helping people teams realize that, much like your culture, you want your compensation to repel the wrong people and attract the right people. And so again, not being vanilla in how it works, but actually trying to find ways in which it can really accentuate the kind of place that you want to be. And one example of that is a company that I worked with, who opted toward an approach of using pay points rather than pay ranges. So rather than having, for a particular role, the salary could be anywhere from 100 to 130. The salary was $115,000, and Tom, Dick, and Harry all got paid the same, no matter how they were performing in that role. But for them, that was the right move, because equity and consistency, that was a really strong pillar of their organization. They also had a really high they're very diverse, a lot of like people with disabilities or neurodivergence and things like that.
Yeah.
And so they didn't feel like at their point in time as a company that they had a consistent and fair and reasonable way in which to determine performance that wasn't in some way influenced by a disability or something like that. And so they said, look, we're all people. We're all doing the job to the best of our abilities. We want to pay everyone the same as that. And we just recognize that we're all inherently different. And that was right for them, but it's not right for everybody. Not everyone can adopt something like that and not have the same level of flexibility. So that's just one example of how it can just be a very, very different practice in one organization compared to another.
That's really interesting. I mean, I suppose also another question that I have for you, and I know as you already alluded to throughout this podcast, you've had a lot of LinkedIn posts, and you've got your own podcast, and you make many different comments and statements. Which I'm not gonna let the cat out of the bag. You guys can go out and look for Matt online yourself. There's a lot of cool stuff he talks about. What is the one thing about human resources that people might disagree with you about?
Gosh, there's, how do I pick one? I mean, the time tracking one got a lot of. Actually, the time tracking one was interesting. I actually got a lot of people came out of the woodwork saying that they had done a similar thing. So that was actually quite endearing. What's something that, I talked about recently, and I think this is really more a startup context, but this concept of title inflation. So if I paint this sort of picture for you of, if you're a startup, you don't have a lot of money, someone's giving you a bunch of money, but you're not profitable as a business. You're trying to hire people so that you can build something so that you can become profitable. You can't pay the same as what a public or an established profitable private organization can offer. So you can't be usually as competitive on pay as they can. When you think about the sort of total rewards, thing that people are looking for, there's compensation, there's financial benefits, and then there's kind of all of these other non-financial things. And title very much falls into that. And that is that, being able to give someone maybe not quite the same salary as they would have got somewhere else, but a title that they couldn't get somewhere else, that's a form of pay. It's a form of value for them. And something I have spoken about is that it's okay for companies to do that, because would they have gotten the role elsewhere? And this actually links back to that thing about, that I mentioned about don't be too idealistic. Yes, it's the wrong title. Yes, you're calling someone a chief technology officer who is at best a senior engineer, but to not call them that, you may not have ever got the senior engineer, and you may never have been able to build the product, and you may never have actually been able to get to a place where you're profitable. Which scenario would you go for? And so in my mind, title inflation is justified in that case. Now, where I think it goes wrong is that then they start to introduce structure. And I see this a lot where you start to go, okay, well, what does a CTO salary look like? Should we be paying this person $400,000-$500,000 when they're actually a senior engineer? And so there's a bunch of different ways you want to handle that. But, that's where a lot of companies struggle, is that transition from, we've inflated your title to get you in the door. Now we're going to implement all the systems and practices to make sure we're being consistent. How do we handle that transition? But I think that's one thing that I would say people would traditionally disagree with, is that we should call, the person what their role is that they're doing. But yeah, I mean, that's one of probably 1,000, Jonathan, that people disagree with me on. I mean, I've talked about things like living wage as well. I fundamentally believe, and again, this is just my virtues, that a company should be paying someone a salary that enables them to live, and you have to define that for yourself, but they should be paying that first before they start to think about what the market pays for the role. It's really hard to think that someone's going to be able to give everything they can to a business in terms of performance and outcomes and things like that if they're really struggling to pay their bills, or they don't have enough for savings, or they can't, even go out for dinner once a week or something like that. Some of these kind of fundamental things that I think a lot of us rely on. So yeah, that's another thing that I would say it probably splits the herd a little bit.
Well, I think like the couple of things that you talked about there, that theme of balancing the idealistic with the commercial and practical to some respects as well, seems to be quite fundamental to what you talk about. And obviously there are, strands that go not just across compensation, not just across human resources, but across finance, across operational. That seems to be quite a fundamental philosophy that you hold there.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, at the end of the day, and again, like I had to learn this as well. I think I mentioned that, like, I feel like I got this wrong a lot before I started getting it right. But there's a balance there between, the culture and how that shows up, and the business and how it makes money, and it can't be too which way of the other, or too far one way or the other.
Yeah.
You don't want to make money at the expense of your people, at the expense of your community, and things like that. I think we've all seen, Tesla is a great example of how that's not working out well for them at the moment. Their sales are in the toilet. Target is another very recent example. A lot of backlash over their reversal of DEI, things like that. You've really got to find a way to have a culture and talk about how that shows up at work, and ensure that that's supported. But you can't do that at the expense of your ability to make money, because otherwise you're not going to have any business at the end of the day. So, and I saw this a lot actually with, really a prominent one that comes to mind is union negotiations. They always come in, and what do they want? 10%, whatever it is, right? So it's like, sure, we can pay that for 12 months and then we're going to close down. So, what do you want to do here? It's a balance. That's that one came through stronger than ever in that union environment. Was just, yes, that would be amazing. I'd love to be able to give you this for sure, but we're not going to have a business and no one's going to have jobs. So how do we find some way to meet in the middle?
It's so interesting hearing your perspective, because you've got that HR background and then you've gone into this compensation area as well, and it's all inextricably linked, but it's also linked across so many areas of any business. And then you've even gone even more niche and gone into sort of startup foundation type organizations. Just like a last bit about that, I suppose a question there, you talk about idealistic or not being too idealistic, and balancing that with the commercial side, balancing that with the practical side. A lot of HR professionals talk about that return on investment, and not necessarily just on financials, but it's visible in some respect. The return on investment is visible. From your perspective, how do you try and put that over with organizations, especially who are at that sort of startup phase or really early on in their journey? And you've got staff that are different ranges of experience. How do you push out that return on investment? How do you make that visual or make sense, I suppose, to those organizations?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a couple of ways I think it shows up, especially with a compensation lens. So one of the most common things I'll see, especially in a startup environment, is that they've, it's not just title inflation, but often they've gone crazy with salaries. They're either overpaying someone, they're underpaying someone, whatever it is, right? Like you're introducing structure where previously structure did not exist. And so it highlights all of these disparities. So there's two ways in which I think there's an ROI from that perspective. One is that left unchecked, they were going to inadvertently be overpaying people in other roles in the future. And I mean, now that's not quantifiable. You can't ever go, well, you would have paid this next role an extra 20 grand. But it puts a stop to that behavior from continuing. And I think, you're certainly going to make friends out of finance if you can sit down and say, well, here's what this role should cost in the future. And they can start to forecast that with their, workforce plan and things like that. So I think there's a real benefit there. And I think, an easy way to quantify that is how many people do we have that are overpaid and how much are they overpaid by? And, here's what saving we could have had 12 months ago if we had implemented, these sorts of systems and structures. But so it's not I wouldn't say it's a direct ROI, but it gives you an idea of like how that would have worked. Another one is I often get this question around like buying salary data and whether or not we should invest in it. And a lot of people I speak to, they rely on recruiting agencies, salary surveys that they put out, things like that. But often they don't have the level of complexity or diligence and information around them to be really robust. And so they go, well, we've got something and, we're kind of making it work, but, we don't really have budget for a proper data set. And it's like, okay, sure. But everyone gets the question eventually of, can I, we're not paying well enough. We're not paying enough money to, let's just use a software engineer as an example. And if they're saying, well, I'm on 100 and I should be on 105, you're presented with a cost of $5,000. If you've got 5, 6, 7 other, let's say 9 other software engineers, you're going to have to make the same change for them. That's $50,000. The cost of salary data is not going to exceed that price. And actually those people could be wrong. And so you could actually realize that when you buy that data, it's only $2,500 that you're off by for your chosen place in the market. So suddenly you're confronted with a cost of $25,000 instead of 50. So you save yourself $25,000. So there's those sorts of ways in which, you can look at compensation and go, here's how it can avert cost. Because that's fundamentally what you're trying to do, is introduce insight where you didn't have it before. And I think often a big challenge that I come up against with companies that are solely using salary surveys from recruitment agencies, and hopefully this is helpful for anyone listening, is that you've got to understand recruiting agencies operate on a percentage of the salary that they're placing someone for. So they are inherently incentivized to have a higher salary as possible because it means a larger fee for them. And that's just the way that industry works. So you've really got to take it with a grain of salt when you see a salary survey, as to whether or not it's actually representative of the market and where you're trying to hire from it as well. And so that's often, one of the ways in which we speak to heads of people or whatever it might be, founders, around bringing in data, because the cost to bring in that data and the number of those sorts of circumstances that it can help you avert in terms of overpaying, it becomes so many that it's actually just worth it to spend the 10 grand or whatever it is and get the salary data and be more, I guess, deliberate in your positioning.
Yeah. Really interesting stuff. So we've actually got a tradition on the HR Engage podcast, right?
Yeah.
So we ask these rapid fire questions, and basically just ask these questions, basically say the first thing that comes to your mind, and that's basically it. Does it sound okay?
Let's do it.
All right. Okay. Cool. All right. So Matt, what is your favorite movie?
It's Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
That is a blast from the past, and also a little bit off center. So yeah, okay.
I used to be able to recite, I think, every word of it. It was, I watched it and I just fell in love with it. It's just such a quirky movie.
Quirky is an understatement, yes?
Yeah,
Quirky
it really is. And it's got everything, right? It's got a bit of action. It's got a bit of romance. It's got the kind of, comic book style. It's, a bit cartoony in some respects. So yeah, it just kind of ticked all the boxes for me.
Brilliant. What's your favorite holiday destination?
This is a hard one. I'm fortunate to have holidayed in a bunch of different places. I'd have to say some of the most memorable ones would be Japan, and particularly, the culture of Japan is just incredible, but the snow is just a whole different, it's on a whole other level. It's like being in a cloud. So I'm going to say Japan. So
snow in Japan, that's the holiday destination.
That's the criteria. Yeah, well, I live by the beach now, so.
Apart from family and friends, who has inspired you the most?
Oh, this is a tricky one because I don't think that there's like one person. I think for me, when I think of who's inspired me, there's a bunch of people that I, have been leaders to me in the past that have been incredible. And in some respects, there's been some terrible leaders that have also influenced me about what I don't want to do. But I think, especially now doing what I do now, I draw inspiration from a lot of different places. I follow a range of different other solopreneurs or content creators or people in the HR space on LinkedIn and in other places. But yeah, there's not any one person. I really draw from a spectrum, I'd say.
Spectrum of people that sort of inspire you and you sort of pick the best bits.
Yeah.
Also learn from the bad bits, I suppose. That's the other part.
Oh yeah, right. Like that's an experience too. You go, okay, well, I don't want to do that, or I don't want to have that experience or make that experience for other people or whatever. So yeah, there is always a lesson in the mistakes.
So what's the one, what's the thing you do outside of work that you're passionate about or sort of keeps you going?
Yeah, so I mentioned I just moved to the beach, so I love it. I get to go for a walk on the beach every morning, which is amazing.
How close to the beach are we talking about here?
I'm like 400 meters away, so yeah, it's a very short walk, and I get to sometimes I get to go see dolphins in the morning, which is lovely. Brilliant. But that's something that is a real just an amazing thing that I've been able to do because of the work that my work has allowed me to do that now. I work remotely. And then the other thing, it's funny, I thought I'd have to give this up moving to Pottsville where I live now, but I certainly haven't, is that I'm very much a foodie. So I love going and trying different restaurants. I love, different cuisines, all that sort of stuff. And the area that I'm in now, it still has that. There's so many incredible restaurants around. And so, yeah, I love, exploring new places, or my partner and I, treating ourselves to something if something great's happened at work. That's often a reward for us, which is probably a bad thing, but yeah, it's something that I love.
That's awesome. And tell us something about yourself that people don't know about you, Matt.
What's something I don't know about me, or they don't know about me? I think some of the novel ones. So I wanted to be a fighter pilot. This used to be my LinkedIn bio. I wanted to be a
Oh,
fighter pilot when I was young, and so I actually almost got my pilot's license. I did 10 hours of flying experience, but yeah, that was like an early sort of stepping stone for me in terms of working out what I wanted to do. Yeah, let's go with that one.
no, that's fantastic. And I suppose I think I already know the answer to it,
Mm.
but if you could recommend a book, movie, TV show, or podcast to listeners,
Well, of
what would
course,
it
this
be and
one.
why?
I'm gonna actually go with a different movie. So, and
Okay.
this one, so I don't know if this is your experience as well, Jonathan. I remember whenever you got like a book or a film you had to study in high school. I remember I hated it because we analyzed it to the nth degree, and it
Yep.
just you kind of watched it 50 times. You'd rewatch sections of it over and over and over.
Yep.
Ironically, I still love this movie, but it's called Gattaca. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Okay,
Yeah.
great movie.
Great movie.
And the message behind it for me was just it's just super powerful, right? Like it's this guy who basically got told he would never amount to anything. He's never going to be, who he wants to be. And he wanted to be an astronaut. And, he's just, I love the message of if you put your mind to it, you can achieve anything you want. And yeah, that's something that I very much align with. And so it's always had a very, warm place in my heart for that film.
Ethan Hawke at his absolute pomp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's the epitome.
Watch
That's
it.
the
If you haven't seen it, watch it.
brilliant movie. And I'm sure a lot of people also went to high school in Australia. Probably also had to study that as well. So you probably know that already.
Classic movie.
Classic movie. And again, your podcast. There's a lot of people listening. Just want to plug your podcast again. What was the name of the podcast?
Yeah, Foundation series. So it's the acronym. So it's FNDN series. It's on Spotify. It's on Apple. It's on YouTube. Yeah, it's all over the place. And of course, if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll see it pop up every now and then there as well. So we've gone
Yeah.
from monthly episodes to weekly now. So that's all happening.
Oh wow, the weekly episode. I mean, the thing is, if you've really loved hearing what Matt has to say today, I think he goes into a lot more detail, and he already has said a few of those things today that he talked about in terms of the titles, in terms of the idealism. Like, there's a lot of that stuff that's discussed, but also brings on guests that are also have a different perspective on compensation, which I think is really interesting. Some of it is a bit, don't get me wrong, a bit strange,
It's out there.
a bit wacky, a bit out there, but some of it also makes a lot of sense and worthwhile at least having listened and exploring that area. Look, man, I think I really love what you had to say all today. But before we sort of close it all up, do you have like a quote or a moment of inspiration you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, this is very much aligned with the Gattaca theme, I think, and probably woven through some of me reflecting on my background. But I've always been a massive fan of this quote from Richard Branson. And I've wrote it down here, which is, and so I don't mess it up. But the quote is: "If somebody offers you an amazing opportunity, but you're not sure you can do it, say yes, and then learn how to do it later." And I think that for me is just a mantra that I've always loved. Right, like I mentioned, I'm not very good at sitting down and learning about a topic. I very much prefer to experience it. I mean, I love diving into something that I've got no idea how to do and just kind of working it out along the way. I think it's why I like startups so much. But yeah, that for me has just been something that's been a constant manifestation, I think, of my professional career anyway.
I think it's a great mantra. I think that Branson quote is something that we can all really be inspired by, and I think that's a really fantastic one. I've really enjoyed this discussion on the HR Engage podcast, Matt, because you've told us about your background in that sort of psychology, farming background. You got your foot in the door, right at the admin level, moved through, had that IR experience. You've had that global experience too, dealing with different types of complexities that, to be honest, I didn't really think about. That yes, there's the legal, there is the way things are done, I suppose, but there's a cultural side of things as well. And you just hit on that point of the key part of communication still having to be a key part, no matter whether it's global or local. And that was, I found, really interesting. Obviously, your journey has gone a little bit different to a lot of others, where you've really focused on compensation. And that is obviously the area that you're now working with. But you also said that it's an area that really permeates not just through human resource, not just through finance, but throughout the whole organization. And you even said that, hey, look, I can have a conversation with pretty much anyone in an organization because they're going to be interested. They're going to be interested in this conversation.
It's true.
Really, really good. I think the key part, which I thought was really interesting, was not getting stuck on being ideal or your idealisms. And I think having that idea of, well, it still needs to be commercial, it needs to be practical. And you even talked about in your experience, you probably lost out on a few relationships. You probably lost out on a few rungs on the ladder, or you've lost out on opportunities because you're probably too idealistic. But you've learnt from that, and you're saying to people, hey, look, think about it more from a commercial perspective. There is a return on investment, and obviously compensation makes a lot of sense in that space. Absolutely makes a lot of sense. But generally, from a HR perspective as well, you're saying that that's something that's pretty key. And I thought, of course, some of the stuff that you had that was really interesting and I suppose controversial in some respects, coming from your perspective, is it's really interesting to see your side of things, how you see it, especially with that compensation bent. So really, really appreciate you being on the show. I think it's been fantastic, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to get a lot out of today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It was a great conversation, very cathartic in some respects as well. So I appreciate it, and glad to visit the hot seat every now and then. But looking forward to returning to the host seat and grilling everyone else. But no, this was fun. I enjoyed it. Thanks for the chance, and I think we hit on some cool topics. So I could talk about this space forever. So I appreciate you giving me the chance to jump on.
It was great. It was also great to turn the tables on you, Matt, as well. Every now and again, you've got to turn the tables on yourself. That I think it's fantastic. Thank you so much, mate.
I appreciate it.
Well, I'm Jonathan Mammerl with another episode on the HR Engage podcast. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, do all those things because Matt's been a fantastic guest on the show today. And I'm Jonathan Mammerl. Speak soon.